Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, the Azure Network Security Best Practices session of the Tech Talks webinar series. We're so happy to have you here. Thanks for joining. I'm Marcy and I'm the digital marketer at Inova Solutions. And today, my amazing colleagues, Nestor and Dane, will be talking about network security in the Azure cloud. Nestor and Dane are both highly experienced IT experts who love to share their passion for the cloud solutions. They are both part of the amazing Azure task force of Inova Solutions, who are passionate about helping companies achieve their goals in the cloud and get far in their journey in the cloud, with Nestor being the lead of the Azure task force. Before we start off with the webinar content, I will be giving you a short introduction of Inova Solutions, who we are and what we do. And afterwards, we will be diving into the webinar before showing you how we can help you with your goal in your cloud journey relating to this specific content. So Inova Solutions is the Microsoft trusted cloud solutions provider in the Caribbean. And we have a gold level partnership for Microsoft. Our mission is to empower organizations of all sizes to create business advantages by adopting digital transformation. We are headquartered in Curacao, but we operate in the Caribbean region. We have offices in Jamaica, Ecuador, Trinidad and Tobago, and Puerto Rico. We have won the Microsoft Partner of the Year awards for the past 7 years. But most importantly, what's very important for you to know of us is that we use what we sell. So for us, it's a pleasure to share our knowledge and experience with you. So without further ado, I would like to start off the webinar. Nestor and Dane, welcome.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for that brief look at Inova Solutions and what we do. So what we'd like to talk about today is an outlook on security, best practices, recommended patterns. And we want to do that because especially during COVID, we've seen a gigantic and unprecedented acceleration of digital transformation and a shift from things that used to live and processes that used to live in a very pen and paper world to a very much digital world. Of course, as more of our businesses depend on technology and as more of our assets turned to digital, it would only be reasonable that then the threats that we face, the possibility of crime, also moves past the physical and into the digital. And that's exactly what we're seeing. As this shift towards digital transformation continues to accelerate, I should say, we're seeing cyber attacks that grow continually more and more sophisticated, to the point where our traditional security tools and our traditional security mindsets, while still essential and important, have not necessarily been able to keep pace. To add to this, and really because of it, organizations and governments continue then to try and ensure that businesses are in fact keeping up to date with cybersecurity, and that leads to constantly changing and constantly more complicated regulatory rules and a regulatory landscape that is then increasingly difficult to keep up with as well. And as we look at this spider web of digital that we are now dealing with, and that really powers and gives our businesses a lot of advantages, we realize that there's also a factor of risk that we need to be able to mitigate, that we need to be able to protect against. So how do we do that? Well, we need a security model and security tools that better adapts to our current reality. And in fact, while the title of the webinar is Azure Network Security Best Practices, what we'll find is that we need a holistic approach to security. And that's what we want to do in today's session. While we will definitely cover network security and best practices in that area, we also want to look at a couple of complementary and related areas that will allow us to adopt this new, more holistic view of security. Now, as we move on to discuss the topic of security and what these best practices are, it's very important for us to understand some key concepts. These key concepts will help us lay the groundwork for our conversation on tools and strategy, and they'll help us sort of connect the dots as we move further in the conversation. Dane, Would you walk us through some of these key concepts, please?
Sure thing, Nestor. Hello, everybody. All right, so let's talk about some of these key concepts. Let's start with zero trust. So as we adapt to this new reality, we need to create a new set of principles. We need to move from the assumption to explicit verification, right? We always need to authenticate and authorize based on all available data points, including user identity, location, device health, services, or workload. We also need to look at data classification and anomalies. We also need to adopt a policy based on least privilege access. We need to limit users' access with just-in-time, just enough access. We need to adopt a risk-based policy approach. And we also need to keep in mind data protection to help secure both data and productivity. We also need to design with the principle that every element in your system can be breached. We need to minimize blast radius for breaches. We need to prevent lateral movements by segmentation, access by network, user, device, and app awareness. We need to verify all sessions are encrypted end-to-end. We need to use analytics to get visibility and drive threat detection and improve defense. These are all key principles of Zero Trust. Zero Trust provides a modern security framework to manage the complexity of today's organization. It's an holistic approach to Zero Trust should extend throughout the entire digital estate. Because we believe the organization needs to embrace Zero Trust, Microsoft has built into the art of their productivity a service that establishes Zero Trust. So let's look at one aspect of Zero Trust, which is identity. Identity is whether they represent people, service, Internet of Things device. These are all defined within the Zero Trust control plane. When an identity attempt is to access a resource, we need to verify that this identity is with strong authentication. We need to ensure that access is compliant. We need to ensure that it's typical for this identity to follow least privilege access principles. Identity is a foundation of security. You must protect identity to protect your data and resources.
Of course, in that sense, we also have to talk about more traditional defenses, right? So talk us a bit about how networking still fits into this picture.
Okay, good point. All right, so as it relates to networking, infrastructure, data, and apps are all built and run in the cloud and are foundational building blocks for modern business, right? As the usage of cloud services continue to grow, cyber risk and threats evolve alongside growing demands as well. So we'll see these terms: VNets, NSGs, firewalls. So VNets, which stands for virtual network, it's a logical isolation within the Azure cloud dedicated to your resource. Each VNet is created and has its own CIDR block and can be linked to other VNets and on-premise network as long as the CIDR blocks do not overlap. You also can control your DNS server settings for VNets and segmentation of the VNets into subnets. You also have NSGs, which stand for the network security groups. This is a resource within Azure where you can create a set of security rules that allows us to allow inbound network traffic to and from your Azure resources, or you can also deny inbound and outbound traffics to your Azure resources. For each rule, you can specify source and destination, ports, and protocols. We also have the Azure Firewall, which complements the NSG. It provides a better defense in depth for our network security. We also know of Azure Monitoring. This solution offers us to collect data, analyze act on various telemetries within our cloud and on-premise environment. We also have endpoint protection, which, your SIEMs, which we use to aggregate data for multiple systems, analyze data to catch abnormal behaviors, potential cyber attacks, and so forth. These are just a few of the tools available to us within Azure.
Awesome. Awesome. And so then as we look to apply those concepts and those sort of general tools to specific strategies that we can adopt or adapt for our organizations, let's take a look at several sort of services and first steps into cybersecurity that we can take, and then also look at a more advanced and long-term strategy. So let's start, as Dane did, by talking about identity. And when we talk about identity, you mentioned, Dane, the importance of securing our authentication and ensuring that the user services and apps that access my resources are in fact who they say they are. And that is in fact absolutely important. You also touched on things like conditional access and identity protection and identity governance. So let's look at some of the ways we can bring those to our organization. And the reality is that it's going to be powered almost entirely by Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory, if any of our attendees have currently deployments in Azure or are using Office 365 or Microsoft 365, then you already know what Azure Active Directory is, right? It's this cloud service that allows us to create and manage identities for our organization. You probably also know that you can hook this into other identity solutions and, for instance, synchronize it with your on-premise Active Directory. You can then use Azure Active Directory to provide improved authentication methods. We're used to passwords, but let's be honest, passwords, especially depending on the user, are not the best method of authentication. They're not the best factor of authentication. And so through Azure Active Directory, we can add features like passwordless authentication through either authenticator apps or FIDO keys or services like Windows Hello, which are built into Windows 10 and modern operating systems. We can also extend this strengthened authentication to additional applications and services through single service sign-on. And so this identity that has already been verified, perhaps through multiple factors in Azure Active Directory, can be used to access additional services such as my ERP or my marketing system or many, many other tools. It also includes self-service management tools, so that for processes like password resets, we don't have to bother our help desk or our IT people, and users can take control of their own identity, but within a secure context. Of course, we can continue building upon this by adding additional features provided by services like Azure Active Directory Premium. And so, for instance, we can talk about conditional access policies, which Dane mentioned as well. And what we can do here is we can use AI and several different flags to identify risky authentications. If, for instance, I have a user authenticating from Jamaica at, say, 10:15, and 20 minutes later, that same user is trying to authenticate from China, then something fishy is happening. We still don't have teleporters. We still don't have that very fast train that Elon Musk promised us. So something fishy is going on there. And when we detect these sort of risky signings and impossible travel, this idea of moving from one position to another in a very short amount of time is just one of these factors of risk. We can take a look at others. But as we identify them, we can then take action to ensure that this authentication is secure. We can, for instance, require additional factors of authentication. So not just a password and perhaps a text message to a cell phone, but also a response from an authenticator app. Or we can even completely deny and block the sign-in, blocking the account until an administrator can react and take action upon it. This can be combined with identity governance, which allows us to, for instance, provide risk detection and remediation tools. When there are breaches, say the Jafit breach or the Home Depot breach of some years ago, large lists of users and passwords are typically released, and there are services, including Microsoft services that Microsoft partners with, that provide these lists of emails and passwords. And what services like Azure Active Directory can do is automatically go through these lists and verify, hey, are any of my users on that list? There's a probability that the passwords are different, but there's a probability that the user was reusing their password. So maybe if user X was identified in the Home Depot breach, then I should tell user X to reset their passwords. I should maybe notify an admin of the organization where user X works. And these are in addition to a suite of many other governance tools, such as management of the entire identity lifecycle, say for instance, by using dynamic groups within Azure Active Directory, where as soon as HR creates a user and assigns a department, Azure Active Directory already knows what license to assign to it, what privileges to give that user. And as the user is deactivated and maybe certain fields are changed or removed, Azure Active Directory can also automatically deprovision it once the person moves on from the company. We can also mitigate the risk of privileged accounts by using things like just-in-time and just-enough access. And these are two very interesting technologies. They allow us to minimize our administrators so that they are essentially not administrators by default. When an admin is going to perform admin tasks, they then have to request admin access, and it is granted for an established period of time. That grant can actually be reviewed by another admin if needed, and it is logged so that we can audit it down the line. We can also allow that grant to provide just enough privileges. So if we have an admin user that, for instance, is going to modify my backups, I don't need to make that admin user a global admin or a contributor even. I just need to make them a backup operator in terms of Azure roles. And so by minimizing both the window of time during which they have these admin powers, as well as the role that they have assigned to themselves, I can apply that assume breach mindset, where even if this account just so happens to be breached, and it just so happens to be breached during the specific window where they have admin access, I can still minimize the damage that is done to my organizations. All of this is also complemented with comprehensive reporting tools to allow myself to meet compliance obligations and say perform an access review. Of course, we also touched on the concept of networks and network security. So let's move on to a couple of tools there. You mentioned, Dane, that during VNets or within VNets, I can create subnets to segment my networks. I can also create different VNets and isolate those from each other. And in fact, segmentation is an important component of network security. We want to be able to isolate components that don't strictly need to communicate with each other to, again, apply that assume breach mindset. If a portion of my network is breached, the totality of it is not. And it can also help me avoid data exfiltration. We also have protection tools to allow myself to be, well, not to be redundant, but protected from things like common vulnerabilities and even DDoS attacks. And of course, we also want to look very quickly at encryption. And there are several different tools that allow me to apply these technologies to my organization. We can speak, for instance, about network security groups, as you did, Dane, which allow us to apply sort of basic rules within my network security groups, within my VNets, I should say, or even directly to resources such as VMs to control inbound and outbound traffic. I can also apply things like Azure Firewall, which also allows traffic control, but it also allows me to centralize traffic control. And so from one Azure Firewall, I can control multiple VNets. Which of those VNets can talk to each other? Which of them should not be able to talk to each other? Which of those VNets have VPNs or site-to-site connections to my on-premise network or to other clouds? If my environment continues growing in complexity and I have to deploy multiple Azure firewalls, I also have the concept of Firewall Manager. This is an additional service that allows me to control all of these firewalls from a single pane of glass. In fact, depending on my needs and on the workloads I have deployed on Azure, say if most of my workloads are web applications, then I can look at specific firewall services, such as Web Application Firewall, which allows not just network traffic and network traffic rules based on incoming source and destination and ports, but also on information on the HTTP layer. And say I can filter and redirect traffic based on HTTP headers or even on the API endpoints that they are targeting. We can also apply encryption to secure our data. And this encryption comes in several different forms. Every single blob within Azure has built-in encryption. However, we also have encryption at rest for workloads such as Azure VM disks and SQL Server, things like Azure Disk Encryption and transparent data encryption, which is a feature of Azure SQL, can be turned on fairly simply, essentially with the flick of a switch. We can also look at encrypting our traffic as it is in movement, as it is in transit, by ensuring our applications and our deployments within Azure are configured to use HTTPS, TLS, and all of these secure encrypted protocols, which are available by default in Azure resources and for Azure resources. Finally, depending on my needs, and if those needs are particularly complex, particularly sensitive, I can also look at the advanced concept of confidential computing, where I can actually have my data remain encrypted as compute is being carried out on it, as operations are being performed on that data. This is a bit of a newer, pricier, frankly, concept, but we can look at platforms like Intel SGX or VBS, which are available in the Azure platform and can provide this complete and total encryption experience. These are called trusted execution environments. Now, we've already talked about a handful of signals and devices and technologies and protections. And as I add more and more to my environment, it can be a bit complex to then manage it. So one additional tool we want to look at is called the Azure Security Center. The Azure Security Center is quite interesting. It's essentially a free tool, at least the basic tier is free, that allows me to have instant insight into the security of several different workloads. It uses Azure Monitor, which collects monitoring data for my workloads, to aggregate these logs in a single pane of glass. I can then see a security baseline that Azure provides based on best practices and prioritize recommendations on vulnerabilities and actions I should take to secure my organization. These recommendations are on those evaluated categories you can see there on the slide: identity and access, compute, SQL Server, network, and app services. And all of these signals and recommendations are aggregated into a single number called the secure score. This allows me to have a simple at-a-glance idea of what my security baseline is. Of course, I can then improve that security baseline by applying and addressing the recommendations in Azure Security Center. It's even rolled in and integrated with things like automation tasks. So solving some of these recommendations is as simple as clicking into the recommendation and pressing fix, and Azure takes care of everything else. Now, where Azure Security Center starts to get interesting is that it doesn't just read signals from Azure resources. I can actually use technologies such as Azure Arc to extend its functionality to my on-premises network and to multiple other cloud providers. And so I can have a single holistic view of my entire environment. But even then, there are additional signals that aren't necessarily baked into Azure Security Center. For instance, we've looked at my Azure workloads. We've looked at multiple other cloud providers and workloads there, at on-premises workloads. But when we talk about these, we're typically talking servers. So where do my end users come into play, and how do I ensure that they are secured as well? And as I bring those end user signals into play, how can I have, once again, a consolidated view of my entire organization? Well, then let's talk about a triangle of three technologies that will allow us to answer that question. Let's talk about Azure Sentinel, Microsoft 365 Defender, and Azure Defender. Let's start talking about Sentinel. Sentinel is a SIEM tool. That is to say, it is a tool that allows us to collect logs at scale from both cloud sources, on-premise sources, multiple clouds, from a variety of different platforms. And it can then aggregate all of these signals and uses artificial intelligence to allow us to detect emerging threats, to allow us to detect anomalies in all of these signals. In fact, by using AI and machine learning models, Azure Sentinel is or becomes an industry-leading SIEM simply because it's able to reduce false positives by 79%, usually over a period of 3 years once it's been deployed within an organization. What's more, Azure Sentinel isn't just SIEM, it's also SOAR. That is to say, it includes security orchestration and automated response tools. And so it doesn't just alert me or toss up a flag when an anomalous behavior is detected, but I can actually start to respond to these threats through automation and orchestration and say, if I detect that a VM may be compromised, I may then automate steps to completely isolate that VM, to disconnect it from its VNet, and maybe even disconnect it from the public intranet if it is connected to that. And there are several different responses that I can take, but the idea is that with a single tool, which can aggregate signals from all of the services we've seen up to this point, I can then have a very clear idea of what threats are currently attacking or may be affecting my environment and automatically begin to respond to them. That allows me to move quickly and a lot more agilely, which is more needed than ever based on today's digital landscape. One of the signals that we haven't looked at before that we can aggregate within Azure Sentinel is end user signals. And we can use that through Microsoft 365 Defender. Now, when we talk about Microsoft 365 Defender, we're actually talking about a suite of tools, both tools that are included within Office 365, such as Defender through Office 365, as well as tools that are included within Windows 10. And these tools provide protection for everything from spam and potentially malicious attachments, potentially malicious links, to actual endpoint antivirus, anti-malware, and detection and response tools. They allow me to automatically stop attacks before they occur by, for instance, blocking malicious links and attachments before they ever get to my end users. They allow me to also have a holistic view to be able to hunt active threats and see, well, if there's a particular address that's continually sending these malicious links and attachments to my user, well, proactively recommend that we add that source to a block list, for instance. And it also allows me to not just see these threats, but also provides proactive recommendations, a similar secure score system for me to remediate and reduce vulnerabilities across my entire Microsoft 365 environment. The more I have deployed of that Microsoft 365 environment, the more signals and alerts I see. So if I'm only using Office 365 online, then I'll only see alerts and systems for those tools. But if I'm also using Windows 10 and the Intune pieces, then I will continue to see signals, alerts, and recommendations for those additional platforms as well. On the server side, we have Azure Defender, and this is essentially the paid tier of the Azure Security Center, which adds a couple of extra capabilities and functionality. We add antivirus, anti-malware, and EDR capabilities to our endpoints. And interestingly, these are not just applied to VMs, but can actually also be applied to additional services, such as our SQL databases, our blob storage, our containers, to actual network traffic pieces, such as firewalls, to IoT, and even app services. And as we saw through Azure Arc, they can be extended to multiple clouds and even to my on-premise environment. Now, what we've seen up until this point is, frankly, a lot. We've seen that there's a lot of things that we can do to provide defense in depth and also breadth of coverage for my Azure security, for my hybrid security, and for my multi-cloud security. Now, we wanted to take this sort of high-level overview look in order to provide this more holistic approach to cybersec, which we feel is necessary to face the threats that are active in our current digital landscape. Now, unfortunately, this means that we don't have time to go into specific design patterns or recommended architectures, but this entire presentation that you're seeing will be shared with you. And what we'd extend to, or the invitation we would extend to you, is to feel free once you receive it to click through that link that you see on screen there, and you will see their recommended architectures for each and every one of the workloads we've seen, and some we haven't even covered. However, we don't just want to provide this high-level, long-term, see how you can apply this in your business view. We want to provide you with some additional tips that you can implement now. And so we want to look at some security quick wins. These are concepts that can be essentially implemented within a day or so and that can immediately improve your security posture. Dane, could you talk us through some of these security quick wins?
Sure, Nestor. So let's talk about these quick wins. First, I would recommend that we start using MFA and conditional access. This you can activate within your Azure Active Directory. Another quick win that we suggest is that we implement just in time and just enough principles. This also can be activated within the Azure Active Directory. You can find it within the privilege identity management. And if you're trying to implement it on VMs, you can use it through Azure Defender. We also recommend that you review your accounts and privilege. This can be performed by doing an access review within privilege identity management. And we also recommend that you start using encryption. It's on by default for blobs, and for VMs, you would require to turn it on. But please note you would need to restart your VM once you have enabled encryption. Finally, we recommend that you utilize your Azure Security Center. There's a free tier available within your Azure subscription. And if you need additional features, that's optional. You can activate those. So let's talk about long-term strategies. All right, so a few things that we recommend for your long-term strategies is that you need to review your security policies, review that your policies are up to date and up to standards, right? And if you don't have any, we implore that you start creating them. So you need to pay attention to what's in your environment, what you're protecting, and tailor a policy suiting that environment. We also recommend that you do some assessment and testing of your environment for vulnerabilities. See if there's any weakness in your environment. Is there any privilege access being taken advantage of, and so forth. We need to always be aware of what's happening in your environment. So constant assessment, constant testing is required. And training. User awareness training, adoption training. We need to always be abreast in what's going on, the latest technology. Ensure that our users are always aware of what's happening. So training. There can never be too much training.
That's absolutely true. And it's interesting, you brought up the idea of security policies, and you were sharing an idea with me the other day that I think it's very, very important. It's the mindset that typically we think of IT operations and IT security as different roles. Yes. More so, when we start digital transformation projects, maybe we started at the business level, which is a very good place to start, but we don't involve security there. We talked briefly through the idea of putting security in each and every one of these conversations. And I think that's a very good point for our audience to take home. When we design our security policies, we have to ensure that they do not live separately to the rest of the policies, IT and digital transformation policies within my organization. We want to ensure that we take a security first approach to each and every one of these engagements. So if we're doing digital transformation, we're just starting the conversation, security should already be a part of that conversation. And that's one of the ways we can apply that zero trust mindset. Actually, talking about ways we can apply that zero trust mindset, Dane, talk us through how Inova solutions can then help our audience implement some of these tools.
That's a very good question. We can assist you in implementing these tools by providing training. We offer a number of training. We provide Microsoft Administrator training, Azure Administrator training, various adoption training tailored to the needs of the organization. So if you need to learn a particular 365 technology, we can provide that training for you. We can also aid you in your workload deployments, whether it's 365 Exchange migration or Azure deployment, we can assist you in this. So any type of workload, Microsoft related, we can provide these assistance. We can also provide consultation in terms of doing assessments. We can provide vulnerability assessments. We can review your security posture and see what's happening in your environment and make recommendations. These are various ways we can help you.
Absolutely. And even through some of our partners, we can continue to extend those offerings into more advanced cybersecurity offerings, right? So even things like penetration testing, even things like deployment of advanced workloads such as complex Azure Sentinel configurations or using AI in your threat assessments and in your threat information systems. All of these are things that we can absolutely help you with.
Yes, indeed.
But we'd like to hear from our audience now. So Marcy, do we have any questions perhaps in the chat? Feel free to let us know.
Hey, Nestor, not yet. I did post a question. I did make a post in the Q&A sections that if anyone has any questions, that they can let us know. But we have not posted anything yet. We have asked if anyone is using Office 365, if anyone has ever consulted Azure Security Center. We've got varied responses, some yes, some no. So let's wait and see if anyone has any questions. Or else feel free to send us a message afterwards, letting us know if you have any questions or if you would like to schedule a quick discovery call with the Azure Task Force.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So any questions, concerns, doubts, this is the time. Of course, we know security can sometimes be a bit of a sensitive topic to breach, especially as we talk about the specific circumstances of my organization, perhaps. So as Marcy mentioned, the doors of the Azure Task Force, the digital doors of the Azure Task Force are always open. Our discovery sessions are completely free. In fact, for our active Inova Solutions customers, there are several services, even some preliminary consultation that we can provide completely free of charge. So we'd love to hear from you. Let's give a couple more minutes to see if any questions come in. All right, looks like so far so good. So in that case, we would like to hear from you, really. What did you think of the session? We've done so far 2 of these Tech Talk sessions. Both of them have been more high-level overviews to talk a little bit about the possibilities and a little bit less of get our hands dirty, get in there, show a demo, show how the configuration works. So let us know, do you like these high-level overviews just to understand what's possible and what's out there? Or would you rather see more get our hands dirty, show me a demo, show me how it works? We can do either or. We are glad to tailor our solutions, our sessions to your needs. In fact, we have more of these Tech Talk sessions upcoming. We want to continue to do more to help enable you guys to use the tools that are at your disposal. I like to say that it's impossible to imagine a color that you've never seen before, right? How do you explain red to a blind person or to a person with low vision? So what we'd like to do is to show you these colors so that you don't have to imagine them with no basis, with no previous experience. That could, as we mentioned, take the form of these high-level overview sessions, or it can take the form of more specific, less content, but deeper dives into these contents. So feel free to fill out our evaluation. You can scan that QR code, which has been on the screen for a couple of seconds. Click on the link, which Marcy will share in the chat. We'd also like to invite you to our next session. It's going to be our Automating Business Tasks with Power Automate session, a super exciting and interesting topic on the Power Platform, which is one of Microsoft's, for me at the very least, the most exciting and upcoming tools. So feel free to register for that. It's June 24th, same time, same place. It'll be a pleasure to have you here. I'd also like to briefly invite you to connect with Inova on social media. We're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook. Like our posts, comment on them, ask us questions. We want to interact with you. I would also recommend for those of you interested in Azure specifically to join our Azure Knowledge Hub. This is our exclusive community located on LinkedIn. And what's interesting about the Knowledge Hub is, number one, All the content shared there is didactical in nature. It's teaching content, tutorials, and content to make sure that you are using Azure to the fullest extent. And number two, there are exclusive events that we rarely promote outside of the AKH, but they are available there in that Azure Knowledge Hub. For instance, our bootcamp series. And we're having another one of these bootcamps later in June. Our bootcamp series is a series of sessions of 2.5 hours. Depending on the topic, they can be several days. In June, we will be taking a look at backup and disaster recovery. Specifically, the bootcamp will be aimed at our Spanish-speaking audience. So if you have people from Puerto Rico, from Ecuador on the call, we would love to have you join that bootcamp. We'll be taking a look at Azure Backup and configuring it for VM backup and for file and folder backup. And at Azure Site Recovery, we'll completely destroy our infrastructure and then restore it based on the foundation that we set up. What's very interesting is that if you are a member of this Azure Knowledge Hub, all of this is completely free. So feel free to join. Again, talk to us, ask us questions. It's a pleasure to interact with you always. And it has been a pleasure having you here this morning. So from my part and on behalf of the entire Inova Solutions team, Dane, Marcy, and all the rest of our peeps across all of our offices, thank you very, very much for joining us and have a wonderful day.